I would be curious to get your thoughts on the broader American media now. You have been in the U.S., as you said, you've lived 4 years here. You're now, are you based here? You go back and forth, or?
I go back and forth.
Go back and forth.
I study here, and then I
So when you see the coverage in the United States, broadly speaking, what are some of your critiques? Don't hold back.
Just in general?
In general. You can be as specific as you want or as general as
I
you
think
want.
the media industry in this country is very outrage-based or outrage-informed, and there's a lot of... I don't know much, like, I'm not the best person to answer questions regarding how much corporations are involved with newsmaking in this country, but there is this impression that I get from watching the news here that there's an incentive to make money, and there's this sensationalism that happens. This was certainly true with the Trump years, and today, you know, you have American people kind of divided into two groups, and they're just screaming at each other from across the aisle. Forgive me. That's the main problem. And then there's, I think one of the biggest problems in American media today is Islamophobia, or like just anti-Arab racism across the board. And I think that needs to be addressed. But I'm sure there are other problems, but these are the ones I feel most immediately as a Palestinian, as an Arab.
And when you see the story about Israel and Palestine and what is happening on the ground portrayed here, what do you think is missing narratively from the coverage?
The truth. Yeah, I mean, you have like a concerted effort on the ground to silence Palestinian voices. You have a leaked internal memo from DW, which is a German broadcasting organization. Sorry, it's not American, but it's all Western, it's fine. You have that sending their employees an internal memo saying you're not allowed to say apartheid, you're not allowed to say settler colonialism. Then you have the owner of Politico saying, if you want to work for me, you have to support Israel. This news just broke a few weeks ago. You know this, you see this. Every single time I sent something to the New York Times, or they asked me for something, they sent it back and it's completely, defanged and deformed. I did a podcast for the Washington Post, and they edited it every single time I said apartheid, which I understand. At that point, apartheid was not,
Was this pre-Human Rights Watch report and pre-B'Tselem reports?
Yeah, so my voice didn't matter then because Human Rights Report didn't legitimize it. So I understand why they took it out. They took out settler colonialism, I understand. Fine. But then they edited out
Not to disagree with you, but I just want to ask you this. I'm not disagreeing with you. Could it possibly be that your editors are saying the word apartheid is a legal description of a reality on the ground, and you may not have the legal authority to declare it as an apartheid?
Well, they took out occupation as well, and that was an internationally recognized reality. Yeah.
No, for sure. That's why I said I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to understand. Did you ask them, why are you taking out the word apartheid? Why is it inappropriate to use the word apartheid?
No, I didn't ask them. I was very offended.
Yeah.
Just hung up the phone. No, but for example, they didn't tell me the podcast was going to be narrated by an Israeli. So I was like, yeah, and our house is getting taken over by settlers. And then there's this voice. Actually, what Mohammed is saying here, and it's American person, and it's American-Israeli person just giving his opinions about my own life, right? And that's a large issue that you have in American media. There have been portrayals that have been great and good and objective, like, coming on your show is great. Friendly. Democracy Now! has...
Don't say that. Don't say friendly.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking.
Neutral.
No, I'm joking.
Objective.
No, you can say whatever you want. I'm joking.
Okay.
It's totally fine. It's I had Mark Regav on after I interviewed you, so
I saw he was embarrassed.
And at the end of the day, as I said in the beginning, it's about widening the conversation and hearing from everybody, which is why, before anyone had heard your name in the U.S. in November of last year, before this became a story, you were on the show.
Yes,
so,
I'm very grateful for that.
At the end of the day, it was a story on the ground, and we've been trying to put the spotlight on it. So, but continue with what you were saying about you did the podcast. There was somebody on the other side, and you felt that it was a bit of an ambush, or.
Yeah, it felt like entrapment, to be honest. I was angry about it, but whatever. And then I did an interview for NBC News, and they took out all of my analysis. And they just said, oh, we're going to lose our homes. I'm so sad. But there was, no explanation why I was so sad. And this is a larger problem, with the HRW stuff also. I appreciate that. I don't want to, but by no means do I want to critique the report itself. But these are, these organizations reach this miraculous epiphanies decades after its Palestinians have already articulated them. No, for real.
Yeah.
Yani it had the, I know many people that work for HRW and they're called field researchers and they're the people who go and meet and collect all of the data and blah, blah, blah. And then somebody else gets to slap their names on it. But if you actually listen to Palestinians, hear what we have to say in terms of framework, in terms of analysis, you could reach your conclusions decades and decades earlier as a human rights organization. Because we have been telling you. But for them, we're just the raw material from which they extract their conclusions. And, at worst, you're angry if you go on TV and you tell your opinion, and at best, you're passionate. But they never consider that you're a reliable narrator,
And so I guess you're now calling for Western media organizations to have a presence in the occupied territories.
They all do. Most of them.
No, they have. You mean specifically Palestinian
Yes.
reporters?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I know our organization certainly has. We employ Palestinians. We have people there on the ground. So why do you think it's still not enough that those voices that work within these organizations are able to have the kind of impact that would lead to, as you're saying, the truth being reported?
Well, it's not so much a question of quantity, rather a question of who has the authority to narrate. If ABC News hires me and gives me a camera and tells me to go, I'm not a photographer. If ABC News hires me and tells me to go to do a report in Ramallah and I'm covering like protests against the PA, but then ABC News decides how the story is going to be told, then ultimately ABC News has the authority to narrate, not the people on the ground. So I want to see that power dynamic shift in American media institutions, simply because we are just more, as Palestinians, we are just more suitable and fitted to report on Palestinian issues than non-Palestinians.
So fair enough. So does that mean, and this is not to criticize anyone involved in this, shouldn't the, what's that?
Nothing.
Shouldn't the argument be made to have more Palestinian Americans in the newsrooms here than those on the ground?
Both. The more the merrier. We should do a Palestinian takeover of the media industry.
Again, no comment. No, but I'm serious. I mean, like from now that you've been on this side of it, I mean, if you're trying to diagnose the problem and you're saying, look, there are news organizations. I work for CNN. They have a team there. They have Palestinian journalists on the ground. They have people in Gaza. I covered Gaza for CNN as a producer. They have Al Jazeera English does, Al Jazeera Arabic does, the BBC does, MSNBC and NBC does. So it's not just about having a camera on the ground. There seems to be another layer to this.
Yes, the structural change, right? Again, it's a question about authority. You should allow the Palestinians in the newsroom, if the articulation is being sculpted here in a newsroom in New York, then you should allow a Palestinian to be in that newsroom. It's about having Palestinian influence over, not necessarily influence, it's just like having Palestinian sight over the headlines that are being reported, because so much they are misleading, so much they are disinformation, and oftentimes they are influenced by Israeli propaganda. This is like well documented as well. So it's not, I'm not asking, ABC News or CNN to give me, their company. I wish, no, I'm kidding. But I'm asking for Palestinians, for a Palestinian like me to have the authority to narrate what's happening on the ground. Not just record it, not just report the facts, but also narrate, create the framework, do the framing.
Okay, fair enough. But let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Okay. Oh my God.
And I'm going to open up. Last question. If everybody, it sounds like you're saying Palestinians should tell the story.
Yes.
I don't think a lot of people in this room would disagree with you. Doesn't that eventually lead us down a road where Palestinians tell Palestinian story, blacks tell black stories, Latinos tell Latino stories, and then we become an identity-based news environment where the only people who can tell the stories are those that have a similar identity? And at that point, what are we left with?
Well, to answer your question, this is not really an identitarian issue, right? There is, and we have a lot in common with the black struggle, with other marginalized struggles. But in our particular case, we are speaking about representation of Palestinian current affairs in American media, where there's clearly a chasm, where there's clearly asymmetry, and where there's clearly a concerted effort to silence and stifle Palestinian advocacy. And right now, the remedy that I'm proposing for that is allowing Palestinians more authority in the narration. I'm not saying a non-Palestinian cannot narrate a Palestinian authority.
I mean, some of the most prominent voices are Israeli journalists that write on behalf of Palestinians, correct? I mean, they're definitely...
I wouldn't agree with this. I think the most prominent voices are Palestinians who just don't get their foot in the door. There's that privilege that comes with being an Israeli, where you can't go to CNN and say, I want to write about this injustice in Palestine, because you're more palatable to an American audience as an Israeli. They say, oh, he's likely Jewish, he's not Palestinian. There's this idea that you're unbiased and blah, blah, blah. But again, had you been, nothing Israeli journalists say on behalf of us is miraculous. And if we say it, then it would have reached decades and decades ago.
Okay. All right. Well, let's open it up. I think we've had a good conversation. I'd love to get a few questions from you guys before we wrap it up. And if you don't mind standing up so we can see you. And if you do have questions, do we have questions from the audience? Anyone? There's a gentleman right here. Please. And I apologize, we don't have microphones, but you can go ahead and I will repeat the question if I hear it. There's a lady right here.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Kiswanya from Time. I was thinking along the lines of your last question on identitarian journalism, which brings me to ask, what other objectives or demands do we as Palestinians or as people who support Palestine have of the media besides hiring Palestinians on the ground, because of the several issues that you all raised throughout your talk? I mean, if every single media org hires a Palestinian but then controls what they say, wouldn't they be controlling the narrative further, meanwhile getting legitimization from simply having Palestinian correspondents? And that's not to discourage having more Palestinian correspondents, but what are ways that we can put further pressure on them in meaningful ways that don't rely on the identity or the personal politics of any individual journalist?
Yeah, I don't at all disagree with this at all. And this is what I was saying about the difference between just tokenizing a journalist, tokenizing a Palestinian and giving them like a camera versus giving them the authority. Alongside authority is also just like creating structural changes, right? The same way we see journalists being barred from saying occupation or apartheid, we should actually implement structural changes where when you report on Israel, you call it an apartheid state because that's what it is. When you report on the Israeli forces, you do not call them Israeli Defense Forces because within that name there is propaganda within itself, right? There's all of these ways that you can implement structural changes. I can't think of them on my feet right now, but I do not at all disagree with you because yes, there is a way that this could be exploited into identitarian and tokenizing, and I definitely do not call for that.
Okay, right here, this lady. Yep.
Hi, my name is Donna. I'm with ABC News. As a Palestinian journalist, I've only been there for 2 years, but just still kind of young journalist, I guess. But what is your both of you? Sometimes I feel like, as Palestinians who are kind of just getting into this field, we worry about being biased, saying that one thing that might just kill our story or kill basically us the whole story. So kind of how do you, I guess my question is how do you kind of get through that? Because a lot of people, especially on the Israeli side, they say, oh, well it's anti-Semitic. It tends to be a line of defense. So how can Palestinian journalists who are still starting out in the field kind of combat that?
I love this question. It's my favorite one. Let's be very clear here. Anti-Semitism is real, right? The fact that I have to clarify that I believe is real is the problem. There is this assumption that we Palestinians do not believe in anti-Semitism as a real issue, and we are constantly being put in the corner, being forced to defend ourselves. The baseline is this: we are facing like I say this as a Palestinian now, not as a journalist. The baseline is I am facing oppression, and I should not be the defendant in a conversation when I'm speaking about my oppression, right? When we're talking about anti-Semitism, it is very clearly and has been articulated by many people, by many Jewish people, a smear tactic. And the weaponization of anti-Semitism, the accusation of anti-Semitism, has been used as a smear tactic. The Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs officially calls it discrediting the message by way of discrediting the messenger. This is official state language. So we should, like, when we are confronted by this baseless accusation, if it is baseless, we should call it as such. We should not be rendered to the corner apologizing for it, but we should call it out. And I know it's hard, like I say this and it's oversimplified, but quite frankly, it's hard, but it's never going to be as hard as living under occupation. And for me, my loyalty lies within the Palestinian people, and I'm not going to fail them just because I'm as scared of a hard, difficult conversation with my editor.
All right, with that, and with that, we conclude this portion of the evening.